should have been trembling. My brother had abandoned me, my pack had sold me for a handful of silver to settle a debt, and I was standing before the most lethal alpha king the North had ever seen. But I didn't flinch. I looked him dead in his silver eyes and told him the one thing no one ever dared to say. "You don't scare me." He didn't roar, he didn't strike, he just smirked, a dark, dangerous thing that made my blood sing, and stepped so close I could feel the vibration of his voice in my own chest as he growled, "Are you ready to find out?" Welcome back, everyone, to Ellen's Werewolf Romance Collection. I am so incredibly happy to have you here with me today as we dive into this brand new journey of fire and ice. If you've been enjoying these stories and want to keep the pack growing, please take a quick second to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. It means the world to me and helps us share these romances with even more listeners. I love hearing from my community, so please drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you're listening from today. Whether you're on your morning commute or cozying up at home, I want to know who is out there with me. And as we get into the heart of Juno and Michael's story, don't be shy. Tag your favourite parts or those lines that give you goosebumps in the comments as you listen. I can't wait to see what you think. Now, let's head back to the Frostspire and see if our defiant wolf is truly ready for the king. Chapter 1. The Scavenger's Debt. The grey soot of the outer rim was etched into the lines of my palms, a map of every scrap heap I had climbed and every rusted piece of history I had salvaged just to stay alive. In the fringe territories, we did not dream of moonlit runs or noble hunts. We dreamt of full bellies and a fire that did not die out before dawn. The frost on our windows was a jagged, cruel thing that felt more like a predator's teeth than a seasonal change, and tonight it seemed sharper than ever before. I watched my breath bloom in the dim light of the cabin, a pale ghost of a girl who had forgotten what it felt like to be truly warm, while the rest of my pack huddled together for a heat that never seemed to be enough. Elder Brad entered the room with a heaviness in his step that told me the news before he even had the chance to open his mouth. He was the closest thing I had to a father, but even he would not look me in the eye as he clutched a scroll sealed with the frost-blue mark of the Northern Throne. The Alpha King had finally called in the ancient debt, a blood price established generations ago, when my ancestors had traded their freedom for a patch of barren dirt to call their own. They needed a tribute, a female wolf of age to serve in the frozen court as a peace offering to ensure our pack was not wiped off the map by the coming winter storms. The atmosphere in the room turned brittle, as if the very molecules of the air were freezing solid around us. The silence in the cabin was a physical weight, pressing down on the younger pups who were huddled near the hearth, their eyes wide with a terror they could not yet name, but could certainly feel. I knew Brad was looking for a volunteer, or perhaps he was simply waiting for someone to point a finger at the girl, with no family to mourn her and no mate to defend her from a grim fate. I stood up before anyone else could find the courage to speak, my chair scraping harshly against the uneven floorboards as I straightened my spine to its full height. I was an outlier, a wolf who had never quite fit the mold of a submissive rank, and if someone had to face the monster in the mountains, it might as well be the girl who already knew how to bite back when cornered. The journey toward the north was a slow descent into a world that felt increasingly hostile and entirely alien to everything I had ever known. As the mud of the scavenging lands gave way to the hard, unyielding permafrost of the king's territories, the very colour of the world seemed to drain away into nothingness. Everything became a monochrome landscape of white peaks and valleys of slick black ice that looked like frozen ink spilled across the earth. The guards who had come to collect me were silent, hulking figures wrapped in furs so thick they looked like mountain bears rather than men. They did not speak to me, did not offer me extra rations, and certainly did not care that my thin leather boots were completely inadequate for this punishing terrain. I kept my gaze fixed on the horizon, watching as the jagged silhouette of the citadel began to pierce the clouds, like a crown of thorns made of glass. It was a terrifying sight, a fortress carved from the heart of a glacier that seemed to glow with a sickly, ethereal light from deep within its foundations. Every mile we travelled made my chest feel tighter, not with the expected fear, but with a simmering resentment that I had been traded away like a piece of salvaged copper for the sake of survival. My pack was safe for now, but the cost was my life, or at least the version of it I had fought so hard to build in the dirt of the outer rim. As we reached the massive, iron-bound gates of the Frostspire, the temperature dropped so sharply that it felt as though the moisture in my eyes might freeze in a single blink. The guards finally came to a halt, their heavy boots crunching in the snow with a sound like breaking bones, and the vibration of it seemed to rattle my very teeth. I looked up at the towering walls of ice, realizing that I was now separated from my home by miles of frozen wasteland and a sovereign who reportedly lacked a human soul. The gates began to groan open with a mechanical shriek, revealing a courtyard filled with shifters who looked as cold and sharp as the mountains surrounding them. One guard stepped forward, his hand gripping my shoulder with a strength that would have made any other girl whimper in pain. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of raw meat and heavy iron, and whispered that I should enjoy my last moments of freedom, because the king did not like his playthings to have a will of their own. I did not pull away from his touch. Instead, I looked him directly in the eye and felt a strange, defiant heat beginning to stir deep in my core, a flicker of something the winter could not extinguish. Just as we crossed the threshold, a low, melodic horn sounded from the highest tower, announcing my arrival to the man who thought he owned me. I took a deep breath of the freezing air, bracing myself for the moment the gates would lock behind me, unaware that the real danger was already waiting inside. Chapter 2: The Glass Fortress. Inside the Frostspire, the world felt like it had been turned inside out and replaced with a crystalline nightmare. The walls were not made of stone or timber, but were carved from ancient, translucent ice that seemed to hold the faint, pulsing light of the stars within its depths. As I walked, my reflections moved alongside me in the polished surfaces, dozens of versions of myself with hollow eyes and frayed clothing, looking like a pack of ghosts haunting a cathedral made of glass. Every footfall on the frozen floor sent a sharp vibration up my legs, a reminder that under this beautiful facade was a cold so deep it could stop a heart in seconds. The guards led me through corridors that wound upward like the interior of a massive shell, past statues of wolves frozen in mid-leap, and tapestries woven from silver thread that shimmered with every movement of the flickering torches. The court of the Frostspire was already gathered in the lower galleries, a sea of pale faces and expensive furs that made me feel like a muddy smudge on a pristine canvas. They did not look like the shifters I knew back in the Outer Rim. These were elegant predators, their movements fluid and their expressions masked by a layer of polite indifference. I could feel their collective gaze sliding over me, measuring the width of my shoulders and the dirt beneath my fingernails, dismissing me as a mere curiosity before I had even spoken a word. There was no warmth here, not in the architecture and certainly not in the people, but I refused to let my teeth chatter, despite the biting chill that seemed to seep through the very marrow of my bones. I kept my chin tilted at a sharp angle, mirroring the jagged peaks visible through the high, arched windows that looked out over the northern wastes. We approached a set of double doors, forged from a dark, volcanic glass that looked like a void in the middle of the shimmering ice. Two more guards stood there, their eyes glowing with a faint, predatory amber that suggested they were deep within their inner wolves, even while standing perfectly still. The atmosphere was heavy with the pressure of a powerful alpha's presence, an unseen weight that seemed to demand submission from every living thing within its reach. I felt the familiar spark of heat in my chest begin to burn a little brighter, a small, stubborn flame that refused to be smothered by the oppressive cold. The guards signaled for me to stop, their hands hovering near the hilts of their blades as they waited for the signal to allow the tribute to enter the presence of the sovereign. I caught a glimpse of myself in the reflection of the dark doors, and for a moment, I did not recognize the girl staring back at me. Her hair was a tangled mess of copper, her face was gaunt from years of scavenging, but her eyes held a fire that felt entirely out of place in this frozen tomb. I realized then that they were not just bringing me here to be a servant or a peace offering. They were bringing me here to be broken, to serve as an example of what happens when the weak are forced to bow to the strong. A low, vibrating sound began to echo from behind the doors, a deep resonance that felt like a distant avalanche tumbling down the side of a mountain. It was the sound of a voice, one that commanded the very foundations of the earth to listen. And I knew that once those doors opened, there would be no turning back to the life I had left behind. The heavy doors finally began to swing inward, revealing a chamber so vast that the ceiling was lost in a swirl of frozen mist. At the far end, seated on a throne that looked like it had been grown from the jagged floor itself, was a figure that seemed to radiate a terrifying, silent authority. This was not the king of my nightmares, but something far more complex and dangerous. A man whose presence alone felt like a physical blow to the senses. I took my first step forward, the sound of my boots echoing like a heartbeat in the cavernous silence, and I felt every eye in the room fixate on the back of my neck. I did not look at the guards or the courtiers. I kept my eyes locked on the silhouette on the throne, waiting for the moment when the monster would finally show his face. Just as I reached the center of the room, the figure stood up, and the temperature in the room plummeted until I felt the frost blooming on my own eyelashes. Chapter 3. Are you ready to find out? Michael did not move with the grace of a courtier. He moved with the calculated, heavy precision of a hunter who had never known the meaning of the word defeat. He was taller than any man I had ever seen, his frame broad and packed with lean muscle that seemed to strain against the dark furs draped over his shoulders. His hair was a chaotic crown of dark silk, and his eyes were the color of a winter storm, swirling with a silver intensity that felt like it was stripping away my layers of defense. As he descended the dais, the air seemed to vibrate with a low-frequency hum, a manifestation of his power that made the stone floor beneath my feet tremble. I felt the urge to take a step back, to put some distance between myself and the sheer magnetism of his presence. But I planted my feet firmly and refused to yield a single inch. He stopped just a few feet away from me, and the scent that rolled off him was a complex mixture of mountain air, cold iron, and something ancient that I could not quite name. It was not the scent of a man, but the scent of a force of nature, something that could either shelter you from the storm or bury you beneath it. He studied me with a clinical detachment that made my skin crawl, his gaze lingering on the scars on my hands and the defiant set of my jaw. The court was silent, the only sound the faint whistling of the wind against the high towers, as everyone waited for the Alpha King to deliver his judgment on the scavenger who dared to look him in the eye. I could feel the heat in my blood surging, my solar blood reacting to his overwhelming cold like a cornered animal preparing for a fight. "You haven't bowed, little wolf," he said, his voice a deep, melodic rasp that seemed to echo in the very marrow of my bones. "Is your spine frozen, Or do you simply lack the manners required of a guest in my hall?" His tone was mocking, laced with a dark amusement that suggested he found my defiance more entertaining than insulting. I looked at the way his lips curled into a half smirk, a gesture that was both beautiful and terrifying, and I felt a jolt of pure, unadulterated anger. I was not a guest. I was a prisoner, a commodity traded by my own people to ensure their survival, and I would be damned if I showed him even a shred of the respect he clearly thought he was entitled to. "I only bow to those I respect," I replied, my voice steady and clear, despite the hammering of my heart against my ribs. "And so far, all I have seen is a man hiding behind a crown and a lot of very cold rocks. You might be a king to these people, but to me, you are just the man who thinks he can buy a soul with a scroll and a threat." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery, a sound of pure shock that echoed off the ice walls like a physical wave. No one talked to the Alpha King this way, not if they wanted to keep their head. But I had already lost everything that mattered to me back in the mud of the outer rim. I had nothing left to lose, and that realization gave me a strength that no amount of royal posturing could ever break. Michael's eyes darkened, the silver in them flaring like a struck flint as he took another step toward me, closing the distance until I could feel the radiant chill of his skin. He leaned down, his face so close to mine that I could see the individual flecks of grey in his irises and the faint, jagged scar that ran along the line of his jaw. He was so massive that he seemed to blot out the light of the torches, surrounding me with a shadow that felt like a physical embrace. I could feel his breath ghosting over my cheek, a cold puff of air that sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He was testing me, waiting for the moment when my facade would crack and I would fall to my knees in terror. "You're a long way from home to be playing such dangerous games," he whispered, his voice dropping to a dangerous low purr that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Do you have any idea what I could do to you for that tongue of yours? I could have you thrown into the deepest pits of this mountain before the sun sets." I met his gaze with a ferocity that matched his own, my internal heat flaring until I felt like I was glowing from the inside out. I leaned in even closer, my chest almost brushing against the dark fur of his cloak, and whispered the truth that had been burning in my heart since I crossed the gate. "I told you when I walked in here, Michael. You don't scare me." A slow, dark smirk spread across his face, and he growled, "Are you ready to find out?" Chapter 4. The Gilded Cage. The echo of his growl was still vibrating in my chest long after the guards had hauled me away from the throne room and dragged me through the labyrinthine upper levels of the palace. They did not take me to a dungeon or a cell, as I had expected, but instead led me to a suite of rooms that were as beautiful as they were isolating. The walls here were a soft, milky white, and the floors were covered in thick, plush rugs that looked like they were made from the wool of mountain sheep. There was a large carved bed draped in heavy furs, and a fireplace made of grey stone that sat cold and empty in the corner of the room. It was a gilded cage, a place meant to soften my edges and make me forget the harsh reality of why I was here in the first place. I stood in the centre of the room, my hands clenched into fists, listening to the heavy thud of the door closing and the unmistakable sound of the bolt sliding into place. I was a prisoner, no matter how many soft blankets they gave me, and the realization made the walls feel like they were slowly closing in on me. I walked over to the window, which was a narrow slit in the thick ice, and looked out over the sprawling kingdom of the Frostspire. From this height, the world looked like a map of white and grey, a desolate wasteland where nothing could survive without the protection of the king. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of longing for the muddy streets and the familiar, rusted sights of the outer rim, where life was hard, but at least it was mine. A soft knock on the inner door startled me, and a small, middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a nervous smile entered the room, carrying a tray of steaming food. She introduced herself as Mara and told me she had been assigned to be my attendant during my stay at the palace. She moved with a quiet efficiency, setting the tray down on a small table and smoothing out the furs on the bed without looking me directly in the eye. I could see the way her hands trembled slightly as she worked, a clear sign that the Alpha King's influence reached even the most mundane corners of the citadel. I watched her for a moment, wondering if she was another prisoner, or if she truly served the man who had just threatened to break me. "No one ever stays here for long," she whispered. Her voice so low I had to strain to hear it over the whistling of the wind outside. "The king, he is not like other men. He has a weight on him that would crush anyone else, and it makes him difficult. You should be careful, child. Defiance is a brave thing, but it does not keep you warm when the sun goes down." I wanted to ask her what she meant by the weight he carried, but she hurried out of the room before I could get a word in, leaving me alone with my thoughts and a plate of food that smelled far too good to be true. I sat down and ate, the warmth of the broth a temporary comfort against the deep-seated chill that seemed to inhabit the very air of the room. As night fell, the palace became a place of shifting shadows and strange, melodic groans as the ice settled under its own immense weight. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw Michael's silver gaze and felt the vibration of his growl in my bones. I felt like I was being watched, a sensation that made the skin on the back of my neck prickle with an electric charge. I got out of bed and paced the room, my bare feet sinking into the rugs, until I realized that the feeling was coming from the shadows in the corner of the room. There was a small, hidden alcove that I had not noticed before, and as I stepped toward it, I caught a glimpse of a pair of glowing eyes reflecting the moonlight. The figure in the shadows did not move, but the atmosphere in the room changed instantly, becoming dense and heavy with the unmistakable scent of the king. He was not there physically, I realized, but his presence was so strong that it felt like he was standing right behind me, his hand hovering just inches from my shoulder. It was a warning, a reminder that even in my private quarters I was never truly alone, and that he was always watching, waiting for me to falter. I turned away from the shadows and climbed back into bed, pulling the furs up to my chin and staring at the ceiling until the first light of dawn began to bleed through the window. I knew then that if I was going to survive this place, I had to find a way to get out of this cage and see the world beyond the ice walls. Chapter 5: Midnight at the Perimeter. The opportunity to escape came sooner than I expected, driven by a restless energy that made it impossible for me to stay confined within the soft walls of my room. I had spent the day observing the movements of the guards from my window, noting the patterns of their patrols and the way they clustered near the main hall during the shift changes. When the moon reached its zenith, I used a piece of salvaged wire I had hidden in my boot to pick the lock on my door, the mechanism clicking open with a satisfying sound that felt like a small victory. I slipped out into the corridor, my heart racing as I navigated the winding hallways, using the deep shadows and the translucent quality of the ice to stay hidden from any passing sentries. I made my way down to the lower levels, the temperature dropping with every step, until I could feel the familiar, biting cold of the northern night. I found a side entrance that led out to a narrow stone walkway overlooking the perimeter of the kingdom, a place where the massive ice walls met the edge of the wilderness. The world outside was a swirling vortex of white, a blizzard so intense that it seemed to swallow the light of the moon and stars. As I prepared to climb down the jagged rocks, a sudden, piercing howl echoed through the air, followed by a sound that made my blood run cold. It was the sound of something tearing, a wet, visceral noise that was followed by a low, distorted snarl that did not sound like any wolf I had ever heard. I flattened myself against the ice wall, peering over the edge toward the dark line of the forest that marked the beginning of the Shadowlands. There, in the middle of a clearing, was Michael. But he was not the man I had seen in the throne room. He had shifted into a wolf of terrifying proportions, his fur as black as a starless night, and his eyes glowing with a ferocious silver light. He was locked in a life-or-death struggle with a creature that looked like a nightmare brought to life, a massive, twisted wolf whose skin was covered in weeping sores and whose eyes were a milky, sightless white. This was a blight shifter, a creature consumed by the dark magic that was slowly eating away at the edges of our world, and it was faster and stronger than anything I could have imagined. The battle was a blur of teeth and claws, the sound of their collisions like the cracking of thunder in the silent night. Michael fought with a desperation that was jarring to witness, his movements fueled by a raw, primal power that seemed to be the only thing keeping the monster at bay. I watched as he tore into the creature's throat, his massive jaws snapping shut with a force that sent a spray of dark, foul-smelling blood across the pristine snow. But as the creature fell, I saw the toll the fight was taking on him. Michael stumbled, his form flickering as he struggled to maintain his shift, his breathing ragged and heavy in the freezing air. He looked smaller somehow, as if the very act of protecting the border was draining the life right out of him. I realized then that the monsters the people of the Outer Rim talked about were not the ones sitting on the throne. They were the ones lurking in the shadows of the blight, waiting for the king to fail. Michael was not a tyrant enjoying his power. He was a soldier standing on a crumbling wall, fighting a war that no one else even knew was happening. A wave of heat surged through me, my solar blood reacting to his distress. And for the first time, I felt a flicker of something that was not hatred or defiance. It was empathy, a recognition of a fellow survivor who was carrying a burden far too heavy for any one person to bear alone. I watched as he collapsed into the snow, his human form returning in a swirl of mist, leaving him vulnerable and exposed in the middle of the storm. I knew I should run, that this was my best chance to disappear into the night and find my way back to the safety of my pack. But I looked at the man lying broken in the snow, the sovereign who had smirked at my defiance and challenged me to find out what he was capable of, and I could not move. The blizzard was intensifying, the cold reaching a level that would kill a normal man in minutes, and I knew that if I left him there, he would not survive the night. I took a deep breath, the freezing air burning my throat, and began to climb down the rocks toward him, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and a sudden, terrifying resolve. Just as I reached the bottom, a second howl erupted from the trees, closer this time, and I realized that the fight was far from over. Chapter 6. The First Cracks. The second howl was followed by a shadow that lunged from the tree line, a creature even more twisted than the first. It was a mass of matted fur and exposed bone, its presence a direct insult to the natural world. I didn't think. I simply acted, fueled by a surge of heat that felt like a molten river beneath my skin. I reached Michael just as the beast prepared to spring, and as my hands made contact with his freezing, bare shoulders, a wave of thermal energy erupted from my palms. It wasn't a fire, but a radiant, shimmering wall of pure warmth that forced the blight monster to screech in agony. The creature recoiled, its sightless eyes smoking as if scorched by an unseen sun, and it retreated back into the safety of the dark woods. I stood over the fallen king, my chest heaving, while the snow melted in a perfect circle around us, revealing the dark, scorched earth beneath. Michael stirred beneath my touch, a low groan vibrating in his throat as his eyes snapped open. The silver in his gaze was fractured, a storm of confusion and raw pain that made him look human for the first time since I had arrived. He didn't try to strike me. Instead, he gripped my wrists with fingers that were as cold as ice, his strength flickering like a dying candle. He looked at the melted snow, then up at my face, searching for an explanation that I didn't have the words to give. We stayed like that for a long heartbeat, two strangers bound together by a secret that neither of us fully understood, while the blizzard raged on just beyond the invisible barrier of my warmth. Eventually, the guards arrived, their faces masks of horror as they saw their king on the ground, and the tribute standing over him like a guardian spirit. Back inside the citadel, the atmosphere had shifted from cold indifference to a sharp, suspicious tension. I was escorted back to my room, but this time the guards didn't just bolt the door. They stood outside in numbers, their presence a silent testimony to the chaos I had caused. Hours later, the door swung open, and Michael walked in. No longer the broken warrior from the snow, but a sovereign draped in regal charcoal furs. He didn't sit down, and he didn't offer a greeting. He simply stood by the cold hearth, watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. He looked as though he wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but his pride was a wall that even my heart couldn't easily melt. "You could have left," he said finally, his voice lacking its usual mocking edge. "The gates were open to you, and the blizzard would have covered your tracks from my scouts for hours. Instead, you chose to stay and defend a man you claimed to hate. Why?" I looked at him, really looked at him, seeing the exhaustion he tried so hard to hide beneath his arrogance. I could have told him it was because I wasn't a murderer, or because I saw something in him that reminded me of the struggling souls back home. But I wasn't ready to give him that much power over me. I stood up and walked toward him, stopping just outside the circle of his personal space, my expression as unyielding as the ice walls surrounding us. "I told you, I only bow to those I respect, Michael," I replied, using his name for the first time without a sneer. "And I don't respect a man who lets himself be eaten by monsters in the dark. If you want to die, do it on your own time, not while I'm watching." A spark of something that might have been respect mirrored in his eyes, and the smirk returned, though it was softer this time, less like a weapon and more like a bridge. He reached out as if to touch my hair, but he hesitated, his hand hovering in the air between us for a fleeting second before he pulled it back. He told me that my life was no longer just a debt to be paid, but a mystery he intended to solve, and the warning in his voice was clear. The games were over, and the real test of my spirit was only just beginning. Chapter 7. A Taste of Heat. The following evening, the palace was transformed for a formal banquet that was clearly intended to be a display of power for the visiting nobles of the Northern Territories. I was dressed in a gown of deep crimson silk that felt like a second skin, the colour a vivid contrast to the monochromatic elegance of the court. As I was led into the great hall, I could feel the weight of 100 stares, each one sharper than a dagger. Michael sat at the head of the long, ice-carved table, his expression unreadable as he watched me take my seat. The meal was a parade of delicacies that I would have traded in a heartbeat for a simple piece of roasted meat from my own hearth. But I played the part of the refined guest, hiding my discomfort behind a mask of calm. Halfway through the second course, a sudden, unnatural chill swept through the hall, extinguishing the candles and sending a ripple of unease through the assembled guests. It wasn't just the cold of the mountains, it was a hungry, leeching frost that seemed to pull the very life from the room. I saw the nobles shivering, their breath coming out in frantic plumes, while the guards gripped their weapons with trembling hands. Michael's face went pale, his grip on his chalice tightening until the metal groaned under the pressure. I realized then that the barrier he maintained was failing, and the blight was reaching its fingers into the very heart of his sanctuary. Without thinking, I reached out and placed my hand on the table, allowing my solar blood to surge forward. The effect was instantaneous and profound. A wave of golden warmth radiated from me, pushing back the shadows and restoring the temperature to a comfortable level within seconds. The candles flickered back to life, and the guests gasped as they felt the sudden, inexplicable heat emanating from the girl they had so recently dismissed as a scavenger. Michael stared at me, his silver eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something that looked suspiciously like hope. He didn't say a word, but the connection between us felt like a taut wire, vibrating with an energy that threatened to shatter the fragile peace of the room. The nobles began to whisper, their eyes darting between their king and the tribute who had just performed a miracle. The rest of the dinner was a blur of forced conversation and lingering glances, but I could feel Michael's focus on me never wavering. He looked as though he was seeing me for the first time, not as a prisoner or a political tool, but as a force that could either save him or destroy everything he had built. When the banquet finally ended, he approached me as the guests were filing out, his presence a dark, looming shadow against the brightly lit walls. He didn't ask for permission. He simply took my hand and led me toward the balcony that overlooked the frozen gardens. The air out there was biting, but with my blood singing in my veins, I felt nothing but the steady, rhythmic pulse of the world around me. "What are you?" he asked, his voice a low whisper that was lost in the wind. No one in the history of my people has ever carried a heat like that. It's as if you have a piece of the sun trapped inside your chest. I looked out at the aurora borealis dancing across the sky, the greens and purples reflecting in the ice below. I told him about the legends of the Outer Rim, of the wolves who were born with the fire of the ancients in their veins, a lineage that had been forgotten by the high courts. He listened with a gravity that made me realize the situation was far more dire than I had imagined. He told me that the cold was winning, and that his own life was the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. But even he had a limit. Chapter 8. The Message in the Snow. A few days later, while I was walking in the inner courtyard under the watchful eyes of the sentries, I found a small, frozen bird lying in a drift of snow. When I picked it up to move it, I realized it wasn't a bird at all, but a cleverly folded piece of parchment wrapped in grey down. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized my brother Caspian's handwriting on the inside. He told me that the Pax of the Outer Rim were tired of waiting for a salvation that never came, and that they were planning a strike against the Frostspire to reclaim their lost kin. He told me to be his eyes and ears inside the palace, to find the weak points in the king's defences, so they could end his reign once and for all. The message felt like a heavy stone in my stomach, a cold reminder of the world I had left behind and the people I was supposed to be loyal to. Caspian had always been the firebrand of our family, the one who saw every problem as a nail to be hammered down. But his plan felt like madness. Michael wasn't the tyrant my brother believed him to be. He was a man holding back a literal apocalypse with nothing but his own will. If the rebellion succeeded in toppling him, there would be no one left to stop the blight from consuming everyone, including my pack. I felt torn between the blood of my family and the truth I had witnessed with my own eyes, a conflict that made the opulence of the palace feel like a suffocating shroud. I spent the rest of the day in a fog of uncertainty, watching Michael from a distance as he consulted with his generals and studied the maps of the borders. He looked older than his years, the weight of his crown visible in the slump of his shoulders when he thought no one was looking. I wanted to tell him about the message, to warn him of the coming storm, but the words felt like treason against my own flesh and blood. Every time I looked at the scroll hidden in my bodice, I felt like a traitor, a wolf caught between two different worlds that were destined to collide. The warmth in my blood felt muted, as if my internal fire was being smothered by the weight of the choice I had to make. That night, Michael found me in the library, a vast room filled with ancient scrolls and books that smelled of dust and old parchment. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat down across from me and watched the way the lamplight played across my features. There was a vulnerability in his expression that I had never seen before, a quiet plea for something he couldn't bring himself to ask for. He told me about his father and the father before him, all of whom had died trying to keep the frost spire from falling into the dark. He spoke of the loneliness of the throne and the fear that he would be the one to finally fail his people. I reached across the table and touched his hand, my fingers interlaced with his in a gesture of silent support. The heat from my skin flowed into him, and I saw the tension drain from his face as he closed his eyes and leaned into the sensation. For a moment, we weren't a king and his tribute. We were just two souls trying to find a reason to keep fighting, in a world that wanted to freeze us solid. I knew then that I couldn't help Caspian, that I couldn't be the cause of Michael's downfall, even if it meant turning my back on the only family I had left. But as I opened my mouth to tell him the truth about the message, a sudden, violent tremor shook the floor, and a sound like 1,000 glass bells shattering echoed through the citadel. Chapter 9. The Heart Forge. The tremor was not an earthquake, but a scream of the earth itself, a signal that something deep within the palace had reached its breaking point. Michael was on his feet in a second, his silver eyes flashing with a renewed intensity as he sprinted toward the hidden staircases that led to the foundations of the mountain. I followed him, ignored by the guards who were too preoccupied with the emergency to stop me. We descended further than I had ever gone, past the living quarters and the dungeons, into a place where the air grew heavy and smelled of burnt iron and ancient stone. This was the Heart Forge, the secret engine that powered the kingdom, and the sight of it took my breath away. In the center of a massive circular chamber stood a pillar of glowing white crystal that pulsed with a rhythmic light, like a giant frozen heart. Around it, the floor was etched with silver runes that glowed with a faint blue energy, but many of them were cracked and leaking a dark, oily smoke. Michael stepped onto the platform, his form illuminated by the blinding light of the crystal, and I saw him place his hands on the surface of the stone. He groaned as the crystal began to draw from him, his skin turning translucent as the blue energy of his own life force flowed into the cracks, attempting to seal the damage. He was the anchor, the living sacrifice that kept the magic of the frost spire from unraveling. I watched in horror as he grew weaker with every passing second, his body trembling under the immense strain of the ritual. The dark smoke from the cracks began to coil around his ankles like serpents, hissing and snapping at his heels as the blight tried to claim the source of the kingdom's warmth. He was dying right in front of me, giving everything he had to save a people who would never even know the price he was paying. The heat in my own blood began to roar, a demand for release that I could no longer ignore, and I realized that I was the missing piece of the puzzle. My solar blood wasn't just a quirk of my lineage, it was the fuel that the Heart Forge had been starving for generations. I stepped onto the platform, the silver runes flaring to life beneath my boots as I approached the man who had become the center of my world. He tried to wave me back, his voice a broken whisper of a warning, but I ignored him and placed my hands over his on the cold surface of the crystal. The moment our skin met, a massive explosion of light filled the room, a blinding supernova of gold and silver that seemed to bridge the gap between our souls. I felt his pain, his loneliness, and his unwavering resolve, and I gave him my warmth in return, a flood of pure, radiant energy that pushed back the dark smoke and filled the chamber with the scent of a summer dawn. The crystal began to glow with a steady, unbreakable light, the cracks in the runes sealing themselves as the power of our combined spirits surged through the foundations of the mountain. The tremor stopped, and the air in the chamber became clear and sweet, the oppressive cold replaced by a gentle, soothing warmth that felt like a caress. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, locked together in a circle of light, while the world above us remained oblivious to the miracle that had just occurred. But as the energy began to settle, I felt Michael's grip on the crystal loosen, and he began to slip toward the floor, his strength completely spent by the effort of the transformation. Chapter 10. The Healer's Touch. I caught him before he hit the ground, his massive frame feeling surprisingly light in my arms as I lowered us both to the platform. He was pale, his breathing shallow and thready, but the silver in his eyes was no longer fractured. It was steady and clear, reflecting the light of the restored crystal above us. I pulled him close, my own heat radiating into his body, as I whispered words of encouragement that I didn't know I had in me. The connection between us was still there, a thin, golden thread that vibrated with a primal spark of recognition. We were no longer just a king and a scavenger. We were two parts of a whole, the sun and the moon, finally finding their alignment in the middle of a frozen wasteland. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice so low I had to lean in to hear him. "You saved all of us. Why would you do that for a man you don't even know, little wolf?" I looked at him, my fingers tracing the line of his jaw and the scars that told the story of his battles. I told him that I didn't do it for the king or for the kingdom, but for the man who was brave enough to stand in the dark alone. I told him that I knew what it was like to be the only one who could keep the fire going, and that no one should have to carry that burden without a partner. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, a look of pure, unadulterated relief that made my heart ache with a sudden, sharp affection. As we sat there in the quiet of the Heart Forge, I felt a sudden shift in the energy of the room, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck that told me we were no longer alone. I looked up and saw a figure standing in the shadows of the doorway, a person whose presence felt like a jagged blade in the middle of our peace. It was Caspian, my brother, his face a mask of fury and betrayal as he looked at the restored crystal and the way I was holding the Alpha King. He had followed me into the depths, and he had seen the truth of what I had done, a realization that made his eyes glow with a dark, vengeful light. He didn't say a word, but the message was clear. I had chosen my side, and now I would have to face the consequences. Michael felt the change in me and looked toward the doorway, his instincts as a predator returning even in his weakened state. He tried to stand, his hand reaching for the blade at his side, but I held him back, knowing that a confrontation here would only lead to more destruction. Caspian turned and vanished back into the darkness, his footsteps echoing like a funeral knell through the silent corridors of the mountain. I knew then that the rebellion wasn't just coming, it was already here, and my brother was the one leading the charge. The peace we had found in the Heart Forge was a fragile thing, a temporary respite before the final storm that would decide the fate of everyone I had ever loved. I looked back at Michael, seeing the determination in his eyes as he finally managed to stand, his strength returning with every pulse of the crystal. He took my hand and pulled me up to stand beside him, his grip firm and steady as he looked at me with a loyalty that was more powerful than any crown. He told me that we were going to face the coming night together, and that he would burn the whole world down before he let anyone take me away from him. The final battle was approaching, a conflict that would test the limits of our new alliance and the strength of the bond that was beginning to bloom between us. As we began the long walk back to the surface, I felt a sense of dread that I couldn't shake, a feeling that the worst betrayal was still yet to come. Chapter 11. The Truth in the Ice. The silence following Caspian's departure was more deafening than the roar of the crystal had been. I stood in the cooling glow of the Heart Forge, my fingers still tingling from the contact with Michael's skin. He didn't pull away immediately, Instead, he stayed close, his breathing evening out as the silver light in his eyes softened into something more contemplative. The chamber, once a place of terrifying pressure, now felt like a sanctuary, protected by the very warmth I had provided. I looked at the king, seeing the way the shadows clung to the hollows of his cheeks, and realized that the monster I had feared was merely a man who had forgotten how to live for himself. The weight of his responsibility was etched into every line of his body, a burden he had carried in solitary silence until I had stumbled into his path. "You deserve an explanation, Juno," he said, his voice echoing softly against the crystalline walls. He led me to a stone bench carved into the perimeter of the room, away from the hum of the anchor. He began to speak of the blight, not as a distant myth, but as a living, breathing rot that had been encroaching on the world for centuries. He explained that the scarcity in the outer rim, the lack of game, and the bitter, unending winters weren't products of his greed or neglect. They were the symptoms of a world losing its pulse. He had been funneling every ounce of his energy and the kingdom's resources into holding the perimeter, sacrificing the prosperity of the heartlands to keep the shadows from swallowing the fringes entirely. As he talked, the resentment I had harbored for years began to crack and crumble. I had blamed the throne for the hollow bellies of the pups in my pack and the rags on my brother's back. I had imagined Michael sitting on a mountain of gold while we picked through the refuse of history, but the reality was far bleaker. He was a sentinel standing at the edge of a cliff, throwing pieces of his own soul into the abyss to keep it from widening. My pack hadn't been forgotten. They had been the shield he was trying desperately to repair. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow, forcing me to reevaluate everything I thought I knew about justice and the man sitting beside me. He turned to me then, his gaze searching mine with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. He confessed that he had played the role of the tyrant because fear was a more efficient tool than hope when resources were thin. He needed the territories to stay in line, to send their tributes and follow the strict laws of the North, because any deviation could lead to a breach in the magical defenses. He had expected me to be another submissive pawn, a girl he could use to quiet the unrest in the scavenging lands. He hadn't expected a girl with the sun in her blood to walk through his gates and demand he look her in the eye. He hadn't expected someone who could actually share the weight he was carrying. I reached out, my hand covering his, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to pull back. The warmth between us was a bridge, a shared language that bypassed the titles and the history of our people. I told him about the message from Caspian, the plan for a rebellion, and the anger that had been simmering in the mud of the outer rim. I saw the flash of pain in his eyes at the mention of a betrayal from within, but he didn't growl or threaten. He simply nodded, as if he had always known that the end would come from those he was trying to protect. The truth was out in the open now, a fragile thing that could either bind us together or tear us apart. "I won't let them destroy this," I whispered, my voice thick with a new kind of resolve. "I won't let them kill the only person who is actually standing between us and the dark." Michael gripped my hand, his strength returning in a surge of silver energy that made the runes on the floor glow in response. He told me that if we were to survive the coming storm, we needed more than just a king and a tribute. We needed a united front. But as we prepared to leave the chamber, a low, rhythmic thudding began to vibrate through the floor, a sound like 1,000 boots marching in unison toward the palace gates. The rebellion wasn't a distant threat anymore. It had arrived at our doorstep, and I knew that the man leading them wouldn't listen to reason. Chapter 12. The Grudging Alliance. The tension in the citadel was a physical presence as the sun climbed over the jagged horizon the next morning. Michael and I had spent the night in the war room, surrounded by maps and ancient scrolls that detailed the weaknesses of the Frostspire's defences. We had forged a pact in the quiet hours before dawn, a formal alliance that went beyond the debt of my pack. I would continue to use my solar blood to stabilize the heart forge, ensuring the kingdom's warmth remained steady, and in exchange, Michael would immediately dispatch supplies and healers to the outer rim. It was a trade of life for life, a pragmatic arrangement that felt more honest than any political marriage could ever be. We were partners now, two wolves standing against the tide, and the shift in our dynamic was evident to everyone who saw us. The guards no longer looked at me with suspicion, but with a guarded curiosity, watching the way Michael deferred to my input during the strategy sessions. I wasn't just a scavenger anymore. I was the girl who had brought the sun into the heart of the glacier. However, the weight of Caspian's betrayal still hung over me like a shroud. I knew my brother's heart better than anyone. I knew that his anger was a fire that consumed everything it touched, and that he wouldn't stop until the throne was empty. I had to find a way to reach him before the first drop of blood was spilled, to show him the truth of the heart forge, before his blind rage led our people into a trap they couldn't escape. Michael watched me as I stared out the window at the gathering clouds, his expression unreadable. He approached me slowly, his footsteps silent on the rugs, and placed a hand on the small of my back. The contact was electric, a reminder of the bond that was growing between us with every passing hour. He told me that he had sent a messenger to the rebel camp, offering a parley under a flag of truce, but he warned me not to get my hopes up. He knew the cost of leadership, and he knew that sometimes even the best intentions were not enough to stop a war once the wheels had been set in motion. He promised to protect me, no matter what happened at the gates, a vow that felt like a shield around my heart. "You don't have to carry this alone, Juno," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in my chest. "We are two halves of the same soul, and what affects you affects me. If your brother chooses to be an enemy of the crown, I will deal with him, but I will not let him take you from me." I looked at him, seeing the fierce protectiveness in his silver eyes, and I realized that he was no longer just talking about the alliance. He was talking about us, about the connection that had been forged in the fire and ice of the heart forge. I leaned into him, seeking the comfort of his presence, and felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known since I left the scavenging lands. The preparations for the parley were interrupted by the arrival of the High Council, a group of elderly shifters who had served Michael's father and were not pleased with the sudden influence of a low-born girl. They demanded to know why the tribute was being treated as an equal, and why the king was risking the safety of the realm for a pack of scavengers. Michael stood his ground, his voice like a crack of thunder, as he reminded them that without my heat, the Heartforge would have failed weeks ago. He made it clear that my word was his word, and that anyone who questioned my position was questioning the throne itself. It was a bold move, one that cemented my status but also painted a target on my back for those who preferred the old ways. As the council filed out, their faces twisted in various shades of resentment, I felt a sudden, sharp chill that had nothing to do with the weather. It was a premonition of danger, a feeling that the real threat was not just outside the walls, but within them as well. Michael felt it too, his hand tightening on mine as he looked toward the heavy doors. We had made our pact, and we had drawn our lines in the snow, but the game was far from over. The parley was set for the following day, and I knew that whatever happened on that frozen field would change the course of our lives forever. I just hoped that the warmth I had brought to the frost spire would be enough to melt the ice in my brother's heart. Chapter 13. The Hunter's Moon Festival. Before the parley could begin, the calendar brought us to the night of the Hunter's Moon, a sacred time for all shifters, when the veil between the physical and spirit worlds was at its thinnest. In the Frost Spire, this was celebrated with a massive hunt, a way for the pack to prove their strength and reaffirm their connection to the land. Michael insisted that I join him, not as a spectator, but as his lead hunter. He wanted the kingdom to see us together, to witness the synergy of our wolves as a sign of the new era we were building. I was nervous, as my wolf had always been smaller and more agile than the heavy-set predators of the north, but the excitement in my blood was a roar that I couldn't ignore. When the moon hit its peak, we gathered at the edge of the forest, a sea of fur and muscle waiting for the signal to begin. I felt the shift take over me, the familiar sensation of bones stretching and fur erupting from my skin. My wolf was a rare sight, a sleek, powerful creature with fur the color of white gold that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. Beside me, Michael shifted into his massive black-furred form, his silver eyes glowing with a predatory fire that made the other alphas bow their heads in respect. He nudged my shoulder with his muzzle, a gesture of affection and a challenge, and then we were off, a blur of motion against the white backdrop of the snow. The hunt was a rhythmic, beautiful dance. We moved in perfect sync, our thoughts overlapping in a way that made verbal communication unnecessary. I used my speed to flush the prey from the thickets, and Michael used his sheer power to corner them, our movements a testament to the balance we had found in the Heart Forge. The air was filled with the sound of our breathing and the frantic heartbeat of the forest, a symphony of survival that made me feel more alive than I ever had in the scavenging lands. I could feel his heat and his strength pulsing through our shared bond, a tether that made us invincible as we navigated the treacherous terrain of the frozen woods. The romantic tension between us reached a fever pitch as we paused at a clearing overlooking the valley. The aurora borealis was particularly vibrant tonight, ribbons of green and violet dancing across the sky and reflecting in the white gold of my fur and the silver of his eyes. We were no longer king and tribute. We were just two wolves in the wild, connected by a thread of fate that had been spinning since the dawn of time. He nuzzled the side of my neck, his scent wrapping around me like a warm blanket, and I leaned into him, a low purr vibrating in my throat. This was the peace I had been searching for, a moment of pure, unadulterated connection that made the coming war feel like a distant nightmare. As we ran back toward the citadel, the other hunters fell in behind us, their howls joining ours in a chorus that shook the very foundations of the mountains. It was a display of unity that I hoped would send a message to the rebels waiting at the border. We were a pack, and we were led by two souls who were no longer willing to be broken by the cold. But as we reached the gates, the mood shifted instantly. Standing in the center of the courtyard was a group of scouts, their faces grim and their furs stained with blood. They had returned from the rebel camp with a message, but it wasn't a response to the parley. The lead scout stepped forward, his voice trembling as he delivered the news. The rebels had not only rejected the truce, but they had also taken a group of Michael's outer sentries hostage. Execution scheduled for dawn if the king did not surrender the Heart Forge. My heart plummeted as I realized that the man who had ordered this wasn't just my brother. He was someone I didn't recognize anymore. The joy of the hunt evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. The hunter's moon had brought us together, but the dawn was bringing a choice that would require a different kind of strength. I looked at Michael, his wolf's eyes flashing with a deadly intent, and I knew that the time for words had officially ended. Chapter 14. Binary Stars. We shifted back into our human forms in the privacy of Michael's chambers, the air still humming with the energy of the hunt. The room was bathed in the soft glow of the moon, casting long shadows against the ice walls. Michael didn't move to get dressed immediately. He stood by the window, his bare chest heaving as he stared out at the rebel fires burning on the horizon. I walked up behind him, my own skin still flushed with the heat of the run, and placed my hand on his shoulder. He turned to me, his expression a mixture of raw desire and a deep, aching sadness that made my breath catch in my throat. "There is an old legend among the high alphas," he said softly, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. "The legend of the binary stars. It tells of two souls born into different worlds, one of fire and one of ice, who are destined to find each other when the world begins to go dark. They are not just mates. They are two parts of a single soul that was split at the beginning of time. Together, they can hold back the void, but apart, they are destined to burn out in the cold." He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of my jaw with a tenderness that made my eyes sting. "I never believed in the old stories, Juno. I thought I was meant to be the last light in a dying world. But then you walked in." The realization hit me with the force of an avalanche. We weren't just a political alliance or a lucky pairing of powers, we were fated. The pull I had felt toward him from the moment I saw him on the throne, the way my blood sang whenever he was near, it wasn't just attraction. It was the universe trying to put itself back together. I looked up at him, seeing the truth reflected in the silver of his eyes, and I knew that there was no going back to the girl I had been in the Outer Rim. I belonged here, at his side, as the other half of the star that was meant to light the north. "I feel it too, Michael," I whispered, my voice trembling with the weight of the confession. "I feel like I've been searching for this warmth my entire life, even when I didn't know what it was. I'm not scared of the dark anymore, as long as I'm standing with you." He let out a breath that was half sigh, half growl, and then he was closing the distance between us. His lips met mine in a kiss that was both a question and a promise, a searing collision of heat and ice that felt like the world was finally aligning beneath my feet. It was a kiss of ownership, of surrender, and of a love that was as ancient as the mountains themselves. We fell onto the bed, a tangle of limbs and soft furs, the outside world and the coming war forgotten for a few brief hours. Every touch was a revelation, a discovery of a language that only our bodies knew how to speak. The silver energy of his soul mingled with the golden heat of mine, creating a shimmering aura that filled the room with a radiant, ethereal light. In his arms, I felt a sense of belonging that I had never known, a feeling of being completely and utterly seen for the first time in my life. We were the binary stars, and as we moved together, I felt the strength of our bond grow until it was a physical force, a shield that no rebellion or blight could ever hope to break. The dawn came all too soon, the first rays of light hitting the ice walls and turning the room into a kaleidoscope of colours. We stayed wrapped in each other's arms, savouring the last moments of peace before the reality of the day took hold. I knew that the hostages were still waiting, and that my brother was still out there, fueled by a hatred I couldn't understand. But as I looked at Michael, his face peaceful in the early light, I felt a new kind of courage. We were no longer two separate entities fighting for survival. We were a single force, and we would face the coming storm as one. The binary stars had finally found each other, and the darkness didn't stand a chance. Chapter 15. The Brothers' Arrival. The peace of the morning was shattered by the sound of a horn blowing at the main gates, a long, mournful note that announced the arrival of the parley party. I stood on the ramparts beside Michael, my hand firmly in his, as we watched a small group of riders approach from the rebel camp. At the head of the group was Caspian, his grey cloak billowing behind him like a funeral shroud. He looked different than the brother I remembered. His face was harder, his eyes glowing with a dark, unnatural intensity that made my skin crawl. He didn't look like a man fighting for his people. He looked like a man who had made a deal with something far worse than a king. As they reached the gates, Michael signalled for them to be opened, and the riders entered the courtyard under the watchful eyes of the king's guard. I followed Michael down to meet them, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Caspian dismounted, his movements jerky and aggressive, and he didn't even look at the king. His focus was entirely on me, his gaze moving over my fine clothes and the way Michael's hand was resting protectively on my waist. A sneer curled his lip, a look of pure, unadulterated disgust that made me flinch as if he had struck me. He looked at me as if I were a traitor, a girl who had sold her soul for a warm bed and a crown. "So, it's true," he said, his voice harsh and rasping, as if his throat were filled with gravel. "The little scavenger has become the king's pet. I heard rumours that you were warming his bed, Juno, but I didn't believe you could be so pathetic. You've forgotten the mud, haven't you? You've forgotten the pups who are still starving while you play queen in a palace made of ice." I stepped forward, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. I told him he was wrong, that the king was sending supplies, and that the Heart Forge was the only thing keeping us all alive. I told him about the blight, about the monsters I had seen with my own eyes, and I begged him to listen to reason. Caspian let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the frozen walls. He told me that he didn't care about the king's supplies or his magical heaters. He claimed that the Heart Forge didn't belong to the throne, it belonged to the land, and that the only way to truly save the people was to tear the citadel down and let the magic return to the packs. As he spoke, I noticed a strange, dark shadow flickering in the depths of his eyes, a swirling mist that looked exactly like the smoke I had seen in the Heart Forge. It wasn't just anger that was driving him. He was being influenced by the very entity that was trying to consume the world. Michael stepped in then, his presence a wall of cold authority that seemed to push Caspian back. He told my brother that he would not negotiate with a man who held hostages, and that if the sentries were not returned by sunset, there would be no more talk of peace. He offered Caspian one final chance to surrender and join the alliance, promising that the grievances of the Outer Rim would be heard and addressed. But my brother didn't even blink. He looked at Michael with a hatred so pure it felt like a physical weight. And then he turned back to me, a cruel smirk spreading across his face. "You think you found a mate, Juno?" he whispered, leaning in close so only I could hear. "You think you found your place in the stars? You're wrong. You're just a battery for his machine, and once you've given him everything you have, he'll discard you like the scrap you are. The rebellion is coming for this palace, and when the walls fall, I'll be the one to watch you freeze." He turned and mounted his horse, signalling for his riders to follow him back out the gates. As they vanished into the blizzard, I felt a sudden, terrifying realization. Caspian wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to see the Heart Forge for himself. And now that he knew where it was, the real attack was only moments away. Chapter 16. Poisoned Words. The echo of the heavy iron gates slamming shut resonated through my chest, a final, jarring punctuation to my brother's departure. I stood on the ramparts, the wind whipping my copper hair across my face like a lash, watching the small group of riders disappear into the churning white horizon. Caspian's words clung to me like a layer of frost that no amount of internal heat could melt. He had called me a pet, a battery for a machine, and a traitor to the very people who had raised me. I wanted to believe it was just the madness of the blight talking through him, but a small, treacherous part of my mind wondered if he saw a truth I was too blinded by affection to recognize. Was I truly a partner to Michael? Or was I simply a more efficient way for him to power his kingdom? I found Michael in the high watchtower, his silhouette a dark and lonely shape against the pale winter sky. He didn't turn when I approached, but I saw his shoulders tighten, his senses clearly tracking my every movement. The atmosphere in the room was heavy with the weight of the coming conflict, a density that made every breath feel like a deliberate effort. I walked up beside him, our shoulders almost touching, and looked out at the fires of the rebel camp. They looked like fallen stars scattered across the dark valley, a reminder that the people I had once called family were now the primary threat to the stability of the entire northern region. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of grief for the life I had lost, and a terrifying uncertainty about the one I was trying to build. "He believes I am using you," Michael said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to pull the truth right out of the air. He turned to face me, his silver eyes searching mine for any hint of doubt or betrayal. "He told you that once your light is spent, I will cast you aside like a rusted tool." I saw the way his words hit you, Juno. I saw the flicker of fear in your expression. I didn't look away, even though the intensity of his gaze was almost too much to bear. I told him that I knew what it felt like to be a commodity, to be something traded for the survival of the pack. I told him that my brother's words were a poison I had been fed since birth, and that it was hard to stop tasting it just because the scenery had changed. Michael reached out, his hand cupping my cheek with a tenderness that felt like a silent apology for the world we lived in. He told me that he had never asked for a sacrifice, only a partner, and that if the price of the Heartforge was my life, he would let the fires go out and the ice take us all. It was a staggering confession, a declaration of priority that went against every instinct of a sovereign. For a man who had spent his entire life being the anchor for thousands, admitting that a single soul mattered more than the kingdom was a form of heresy. I felt the heat in my blood flare in response to his honesty, a radiant surge of warmth that pushed back the lingering chill of Caspian's accusations. But as we stood there, locked in a moment of fragile understanding, a dark shape began to move within the rebel camp. It wasn't a rider or a scout, but a swirling, unnatural mist that seemed to rise directly from the earth. It moved with a predatory intelligence, flowing toward the base of the mountain like a river of liquid shadows. I realized then that Caspian hadn't just been posturing. He had brought the blight with him, using his own connection to the scavenging lands to anchor the darkness to our doorstep. The environment grew heavy with a sharp, metallic static that made the hair on my arms stand up. The poisoned words of my brother were only the beginning of the attack, and as the mist reached the first layer of our defenses, I knew that the night was about to get much, much colder. Chapter 17. The Coldest Night. The storm did not arrive with the typical howl of the wind. It arrived with a silence so absolute that it felt like the world had stopped breathing. From the high windows of the citadel, I watched as the horizon vanished behind a wall of grey-white fog that looked like crushed bone. This was not a natural blizzard. It was the blight mist, a concentrated surge of the dark magic that Michael had spent his life fighting. The temperature plummeted to a level that made the very stones of the palace groan and crack, and even my solar blood struggled to keep the creeping frost from my fingertips. Michael stood in the center of the war room, his face a mask of grim determination as reports of breaches along the perimeter began to pour in. "I have to go to the border," he said, his voice echoing in the hollow silence of the hall. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw a flicker of genuine hesitation in his eyes. He knew that leaving me here made the Heartforge vulnerable, but if he didn't stabilize the outer barriers, the mist would drown the city before the sun could rise. He gripped my shoulders, his hands radiating a fierce, desperate cold that seemed to demand my strength. He told me to stay in the depths, to keep my heat focused on the anchor, and to trust no one, not even the guards he left behind to protect me. It was a parting that felt like a final goodbye, a severance of the bond that had become my only lifeline in this frozen world. As soon as he vanished into the swirling white chaos of the courtyard, the palace felt like a tomb. I descended to the Heartforge, the silver runes on the floor flickering like dying embers. The environment was dense with a sense of impending doom, the rhythmic pulse of the crystal sounding more like a frantic heartbeat than a steady engine. I placed my hands on the glass-like surface, pouring every ounce of my warmth into the stone, trying to compensate for the leaching cold that was pouring in from the vents. I was alone in the dark, surrounded by the shifting shadows of the mountain, listening to the distant sounds of battle echoing down the stairwells. Every clash of steel and every howl of a dying wolf felt like a strike against my own soul. Hours passed in a blur of exhaustion and heat. I was so focused on the crystal that I didn't hear the door to the chamber open. I didn't notice the silent shadows sliding across the walls until a cold, familiar voice cut through the hum of the forge. "It looks so much smaller in person," Caspian said, stepping out of the darkness. He wasn't wearing his furs anymore. His skin was pale and etched with black veins that pulsed with a rhythmic, dark light. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out and refilled with the very rot we were trying to stop. He didn't look at me with love, or even with the anger he had shown at the gate. He looked at me with the cold, calculating hunger of a predator. I stood my ground, my hands still pressed to the crystal, my heart hammering against my ribs. I asked him how he had gotten past the guards, but the answer was written in the blood on his hands and the vacant stare of the sentry who followed him into the room like a mindless puppet. Caspian told me that the king had been lured away, that the attack on the border was nothing more than a distraction to leave the heart of the kingdom exposed. He moved toward the platform, his presence causing the silver runes to turn black as he walked. He wasn't here to reclaim the magic for the people. He was here to extinguish the light forever. And as he reached for the crystal, I realized that I was the only thing standing between him and the end of our world. Chapter 18. Betrayal's Sting. Caspian's hand stopped inches from the crystal, the dark veins in his arm thrumming with a visible, oily energy. He looked at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw a glimmer of the boy I had grown up with, the one who had protected me from the pack bullies and shared his meagre rations during the leanest winters. But that glimmer was quickly smothered by a surge of the black mist that swirled in his pupils. He told me that I didn't understand the glory of what was coming, that the blight wasn't a sickness, but an evolution. He believed that by destroying the anchor, the shifters would be forced to adapt, to become something stronger that didn't need the protection of a king or the warmth of a forge. "You've been lied to, Juno," he hissed, his voice sounding like two stones grinding together. "Michael isn't saving the world. He's stalling the inevitable. He's keeping us weak and dependent on his scraps. Join me, and we can be the architects of the new world. Your blood, it's the key to making the transition painless for our pack." I felt a wave of nausea roll through me at the casual way he spoke of our people as experiments. The betrayal stung worse than any physical wound, a jagged tear in the fabric of my identity. He wasn't my brother anymore. He was a vessel for a corruption that sought to turn our very nature into a weapon. I pulled my hands from the crystal and stood between him and the anchor, my internal heat rising until the air around me began to shimmer. I told him that I would rather die in the cold as a human than live in the dark as a monster. I called him a coward for trading his soul for power, and a traitor for leading our people into a war they didn't want. The mask of calm on his face shattered, replaced by a snarling fury that looked more like a beast than a wolf. He lunged at me, his fingers elongated into talons that dripped with the dark smoke of the blight. I met his attack with a burst of solar blood, a wave of pure radiance that sent him crashing back against the stone walls of the chamber. The conflict in the Heartforge was a chaotic blur of light and shadow. Caspian was faster than he had ever been, his movements unpredictable and fueled by a strength that shouldn't have been possible. But my heat was a natural repellent to the darkness he carried, a physical barrier that he couldn't penetrate without burning his own flesh. We circled each other like two sides of a coin, the clashing of our powers creating a rhythmic booming that shook the very foundations of the mountain. I could feel the heart forge reacting to the struggle, the crystal pulsing erratically as it struggled to maintain its balance amidst the violence. I was winning, but I could feel my strength flagging, the constant drain of the anchor and the battle taking their toll. Caspian realized he couldn't defeat me through force alone, so he changed his tactics. He stepped back, a cruel smirk spreading across his face as he gestured toward the flickering runes on the floor. He told me that while we were playing games in the dark, the king was being led into a trap that he couldn't escape. He revealed that the blight monsters at the border were not just attacking. They were herding Michael toward a specific point in the valley where the ground was thin and the darkness was deepest. He told me that by the time I finished defending this worthless stone, my mate would be nothing more than a memory. The words were a calculated strike, and as I looked at the doorway, I realized I had to choose: save the kingdom or save the man I loved. Chapter 19. The trap is sprung. The choice was a physical weight, a crushing pressure that threatened to split my heart in two. If I stayed, I could protect the heart forge and ensure the survival of the city, but Michael would die alone in the snow. If I left, the anchor would likely fail, and the blight would consume everyone I had sworn to protect. I looked at the pulsing crystal, then back at the twisted version of my brother who was laughing at my agony. I realized then that I didn't have to choose between them. I had to be both. I reached deep into the core of my being, pulling at every remaining spark of solar blood, and slammed my palms onto the floor. I didn't feed the crystal. I ignited the runes, leaving behind a residual wall of fire that would hold the chamber for at least an hour. I didn't wait to see if the barrier held. I turned and sprinted from the chamber, my feet flying over the frozen floors as I raced toward the upper levels. The palace was a war zone, the sounds of fighting growing louder as I reached the main courtyard. I didn't stop to help the guards or join the fray. I shifted into my white gold wolf form mid-stride, leaping over the fallen gates and disappearing into the blinding white chaos of the storm. The scent of Michael was faint, a trail of silver and cold iron that was being rapidly erased by the blight mist. But the bond between us was a beacon that pointed me toward the valley floor. I ran until my lungs burned and my paws were raw, fueled by a desperation that I had never known. As I reached the edge of the valley, the mist cleared for a fleeting second, revealing a sight that made my blood run cold. Michael was surrounded, his massive black wolf form covered in wounds and his movements sluggish. He was standing in the center of a frozen lake, the ice beneath him cracked and glowing with an eerie green light. The monsters weren't attacking him. They were simply waiting, their sightless eyes fixed on him as the darkness from the lake began to rise like ink in water. It was a ritual site, an ancient place of power that the blight had corrupted, and Michael had been lured into the very center of the snare. He was being used as a lightning rod, his own alpha energy being channeled to bridge the gap between our world and the void. I let out a howl that shook the very air, a defiant cry that announced my arrival to the monsters and the man I loved. I didn't hesitate. I dove into the circle of creatures, my fur radiating a heat so intense that it turned the snow into steam. I was a streak of white gold lightning, tearing through the matted fur and corrupted flesh of the blight monsters, clearing a path toward the center of the lake. Michael looked up, his silver eyes widening as he recognized me, a spark of renewed hope flickering in the depths of his exhaustion. But the green light from the ice was growing brighter, and the vibration in the ground was becoming a deafening roar that threatened to swallow us both. I reached the center of the lake just as the ice began to shatter. I shifted back into my human form, my hands reaching for Michael as the dark water surged upward. We were trapped in the middle of a collapsing world, the air around us thick with the screams of the monsters and the grinding of the ice. Michael pulled me against him, his body a shield against the rising tide of darkness, but I could feel the energy being drained from him at an impossible rate. He looked at me, his face pale, and his expression one of tragic finality. He told me that there was only one way to stop the breach, and it was a price he had always known he would have to pay. Chapter 20. The King's Sacrifice. The green light from the depths of the lake was no longer just a glow. It was a physical force, a pillar of corrosive energy that was anchoring itself to Michael's soul. He stood tall despite the weight of it, his hands gripping mine with a strength that felt like it was trying to transfer his very essence into my palms. I could see the cracks forming in his skin, glowing with that same sickly light, as the blight began to pull the life force directly from his wolf spirit. He wasn't just dying, he was being unmade, his energy used to fuel the very apocalypse he had spent his life preventing. I screamed his name, my own heat flaring in a desperate attempt to burn away the connection, but the darkness was too vast, too hungry. "Juno, listen to me," he said, his voice steady even as his form began to flicker and blur. "The anchor in the citadel isn't enough to close a breach this deep. It requires the sacrifice of an alpha's spirit, a total release of the power I've carried since birth. If I don't do this, the mist will cover the entire continent by dawn. There will be nothing left for you to save." I shook my head, tears freezing on my cheeks as I realized what he was saying. He was going to give up his wolf, the very core of his identity, to seal the hole in the world. It wouldn't just kill him, it would leave him a shell, a human with no way to defend himself in a world full of predators. It was the ultimate act of a king, and the ultimate tragedy for the man I had finally come to love. He began the ritual, his voice chanting in an ancient tongue that made the air vibrate with a terrifying resonance. The silver energy of his soul began to pour out of him, a brilliant, blinding stream of light that clashed with the green darkness of the lake. The ground beneath us groaned as the two forces collided, creating a vortex of energy that pulled at my hair and clothes. I refused to let go of him, my solar blood surging to meet his silver light, our powers intertwining in a desperate, last-stand defense. I felt the moment his wolf spirit began to tear away, a sensation of profound loss that echoed through our shared bond like a funeral bell. He was fading, his presence becoming thin and translucent as he gave everything to the land. The monsters around the lake began to dissolve, their corrupted forms unable to withstand the purity of the light Michael was releasing. The green pillar began to shrink, the breach in the ice slowly knitting itself back together as the alpha energy sealed the wound. But the cost was visible in every line of Michael's face. He was aging before my eyes, the silver in his gaze dulling to a flat grey, his massive frame shrinking as the power that had defined him was stripped away. I pulled him closer, trying to hold him together with my own warmth, but I felt like I was trying to catch smoke with my bare hands. The world was being saved, but the man who had saved it was disappearing into the light. As the final surge of energy erupted from his chest, the green light vanished completely, replaced by a profound, terrifying silence. The lake was solid ice once more, the mist was gone, and the stars were visible in the clear winter sky. Michael collapsed into my arms, his body cold and his breathing so faint I could barely feel it. He was no longer a king, no longer an alpha. He was just a man broken and emptied by the weight of his own crown. I looked up at the sky, the binary stars shining brightly above us, and felt a surge of pure, unadulterated fury. We had won the battle, but the price was too high. I looked down at Michael's pale face and knew that the story wasn't over yet. If he had sacrificed his soul for the world, then I would have to find a way to bring it back. Chapter 21. The Solar Eclipse. The silence of the frozen lake was a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to press the very breath from my lungs. I looked down at Michael, his face so pale it was almost translucent against the dark, matted furs of his collar. The vibrant, terrifying power that had once radiated from him in waves was gone, leaving behind a hollow shell of the man who had claimed to be my king. His wolf was gone, sacrificed to seal the breach, and without that primal spirit to anchor him, his body was rapidly losing the battle against the creeping frost. I could feel the heat in my own blood screaming at the injustice of it, a roaring furnace of solar blood that demanded to be shared. I pulled him against my chest, my hands shaking as I cupped his face, trying to pour every ounce of my internal sun into his cooling skin. I closed my eyes and reached deeper into my soul than I ever had before, past the fear and the exhaustion, searching for the core of the fire that lived within me. I didn't just want to warm him, I wanted to ignite him. I envisioned the binary stars, the legend he had whispered to me in the dark, and I realized that a star doesn't just give off heat, it creates it through a violent, beautiful merger of forces. I pressed my forehead against his, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm that seemed to echo in the silent valley. The silver energy that lingered in the air from his sacrifice began to swirl around us, drawn to the golden light of my own power. It was a literal eclipse of our spirits, a moment where the sun and the moon of our existences overlapped and became something entirely new. The sensation was like being struck by a bolt of lightning that refused to leave. A blinding golden white light erupted from the point where our skin met, a surge of energy so potent that it cracked the new ice of the lake once again. I felt my consciousness expand, touching the edges of the universe, and then slamming back into the tiny, fragile space of Michael's heart. I didn't just feel my own warmth, I felt the vacuum where his wolf had been, a jagged, empty hole that was hungrily reaching out for anything to fill the void. I gave it everything. I gave him my strength, my memories of the sun, and the stubborn, defiant love that had replaced my hatred. I felt the moment his heart gave a sudden, violent thrum, a spark of silver reigniting in the center of the golden fire I was feeding him. The energy shifted, no longer a drain, but a cycle. The power flowed from me to him and back again, a closed loop that defied the laws of the natural world. Michael's eyes snapped open, and for a heartbeat, they were neither silver nor brown. They were a brilliant, burning gold that reflected the supernova happening between us. He gasped, his lungs filling with the first warm air he had tasted in years, and his grip on my arms tightened with a strength that was far from human. He wasn't just a man anymore, and he wasn't the old Alpha King either. He was something transformed, a creature born of a solar sacrifice. The ground beneath us hummed with a renewed frequency, a song of balance that radiated outward, pushing the last remnants of the blight mist into the far corners of the earth. We stayed there for a long time, tangled together in the middle of the shattered ice, watching as the sky began to change. The green and violet of the aurora were gone, replaced by a warm, honey-coloured glow that looked like a permanent dawn. Michael touched my cheek, his fingers no longer cold but radiating a steady, comforting heat that matched my own. He looked at me with a reverence that made my soul ache, a look that said more than any vow ever could. But as the light began to settle and the world returned to a semblance of reality, a shadow fell over us from the ridge above. I looked up, expecting to see the king's guard, but instead I saw the twisted, dark silhouette of my brother, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. He had survived the Heartforge, and he wasn't done with us yet. Chapter 22. The Fall of the Traitor. Caspian descended the ridge with a slow, predatory grace that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He was no longer the man I had shared a hearth with in the Outer Rim. He was a walking monument to the rot he had embraced. The black veins on his face had spread, turning his skin into a map of decay, and his eyes were twin pits of swirling, dark smoke. He looked at the restored lake and the glowing, golden energy that still clung to Michael and me, and a low, guttural snarl ripped from his throat. He had come to witness a funeral, and instead, he was finding a resurrection. He raised his hands, and the shadows of the valley seemed to stretch and twist toward him, answering the call of the corruption that lived in his marrow. "You think you've won?" Caspian's voice was a distorted rasp, sounding like ice grinding against a tombstone. "You think a little light can stop the inevitable? The world is dying, Juno, and all you've done is prolong the agony of a corpse. I will tear that heart out of him myself and feed it to the dark." He lunged toward us, his form flickering as he moved with unnatural speed, a blur of shadow and matted fur. Michael started to stand, his movements still a bit stiff from his transformation, but I stepped in front of him. This was my fight. This was the blood of the Outer Rim, facing the poison that had tried to claim it. I felt the golden fire of our shared bond surge into my palms, a radiant power that felt as solid as a blade. The confrontation was a clash of fundamental forces. Every time Caspian struck with his shadow claws, I met him with a burst of solar radiance that sent him reeling. He was strong, fueled by a desperation that bordered on insanity, but he was fighting a losing battle against a light that he no longer understood. I saw the way the darkness in his eyes flickered and died whenever I got close, the purity of the solar blood acting as a direct toxin to the blight. I didn't want to kill him. I wanted to find my brother inside the monster, but as we traded blows, I realized that Caspian was gone. There was nothing left but the hunger of the void, a hollow shell that was using his memories as a weapon against me. "I loved you, Caspian!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the frozen walls of the valley as I caught his wrists, the heat of my skin making his dark veins smoke. "I would have followed you anywhere, but you chose the dark over your own family. You chose to be a monster instead of a man." He screamed, a sound of pure agony that had nothing to do with the heat of my hands. The black mist in his eyes surged, attempting to overwhelm me, but I felt Michael's hand on my shoulder. His power flowed into me, a steadying silver current that turned my golden fire into something unbreakable. Together, we were a force that the darkness couldn't touch, a united front that stood as a final judgment against the traitor. With a final, desperate surge of energy, I pushed Caspian back, the golden light from my palms erupting in a wave that cleared the valley of every remaining shadow. The black veins on his skin began to dissolve, the corruption being burned away by the intensity of the light. He fell to the ground, his form shrinking as the dark magic abandoned him, leaving him gasping in the snow. He wasn't dead, but he was empty. A man who had lost everything in his quest for a power that had only ever intended to consume him. He looked at me one last time, a flicker of the old Caspian appearing in his grey, hollow eyes, before he turned and crawled toward the shadows of the forest, a broken exile with no pack and no future. I watched him go, a heavy sadness in my chest, knowing that some wounds could never truly be healed. Chapter 23. The King and His Queen. The journey back to the Frostspire was unlike the one that had brought me there. Instead of a prisoner in the back of a wagon, I rode at the head of the column beside Michael, our horses moving in a synchronized rhythm that matched the new pulse of the land. The blizzard had ceased entirely, and the air was crisp and clear, filled with the scent of crushed juniper and the promise of a spring that had been delayed for a generation. As we approached the citadel, the massive gates swung open, not with a groan of iron, but with a triumphant chime that echoed through the mountain. The people were gathered in the courtyard, scavengers, nobles, and guards alike, all of them waiting in a silence that was no longer heavy with fear, but with a profound, uncertain hope. Michael dismounted first, his movements fluid and powerful, the golden tint in his eyes a permanent reminder of the change that had occurred on the lake. He didn't head for the throne. Instead, he turned and reached for my hand, helping me down with a gentleness that drew a collective gasp from the court. He led me to the center of the courtyard, standing before his people as a man who had died and been reborn for their sake. He spoke to them then, his voice a deep, resonant hum that seemed to reach every corner of the fortress. He told them the truth of the Heartforge, of the sacrifice he had made, and of the girl from the Outer Rim who had been the only one brave enough to save a king who had lost his way. "The era of the solitary anchor is over," Michael declared, his hand tightening on mine as he looked out at the sea of faces. "We are no longer a kingdom of ice and secrets. We are a people of the sun and the moon, bound together by a bond that no shadow can break. Juno Vane did not come here as a tribute. She came as a savior. And today, she stands as my equal." He turned to me, and in front of the entire kingdom, the man who had once smirked at my defiance dropped to one knee. He didn't ask for my submission. He asked for my partnership. He asked me to be the queen of the Frostspire, to rule beside him as a sovereign of the new world we had forged in the fire of the lake. The court erupted in a roar of approval that shook the very foundations of the citadel. I looked around at the faces of the people I had once feared, seeing the genuine respect and the dawning realization that their lives were about to change for the better. The guards who had once dragged me through the halls now bowed their heads as I passed, their amber eyes glowing with a new kind of loyalty. I felt a surge of pride, not for the crown or the title, but for the fact that I had stayed true to myself in the face of a monster. I had told the Alpha King he didn't scare me, and in doing so, I had forced him to become the man he was always meant to be. I took his hand and pulled him back to his feet, my heart full to the point of bursting. We spent the evening in the Great Hall, which had been transformed with thousands of candles and boughs of green cedar that filled the air with a fresh, living fragrance. There was no more unnatural chill, no more leeching frost. The warmth was a physical presence, a gift from the Heartforge that was now being shared with every corner of the realm. Michael and I sat at the head of the table, but we weren't isolated by a dais. We were surrounded by the leaders of the scavenging packs and the northern nobles, all of them engaged in a conversation that was the first step toward a true alliance. But even amidst the celebration, I could see the way Michael looked at me when he thought no one was watching, a look of such intense, private devotion that it made the rest of the world fade into the background. Chapter 24. Sovereigns of the Spire. The coronation took place beneath the highest spire of the palace, a place where the ice was so clear it looked like a lens focused on the heavens. The binary stars were visible even in the midday sky, a twin beacon of gold and silver that oversaw the transition of power. I was dressed in a gown of white gold silk that seemed to catch every ray of light, my hair flowing free like a copper river down my back. Michael stood beside me in robes of deep charcoal and silver, his presence a stabilizing force that grounded the electric energy of the day. The high priest, an old wolf who had seen the rise and fall of three kings, placed the twin crowns on our heads. Not heavy circles of gold, but delicate wreaths of enchanted ice that would never melt as long as our bond remained strong. After the ceremony, Michael led me away from the cheering crowds, through the winding hallways and down into the very depths of the mountain. We returned to the Heart Forge, but it was no longer a place of smoke and shadows. The crystal was glowing with a steady, rhythmic radiance, and the silver runes on the floor had been joined by golden lines that traced the history of our merger. But the most incredible change was the garden that had begun to grow in the warmth of the chamber. Bioluminescent flowers in shades of blue and gold were blooming from the cracks in the stone, their soft light reflecting in the crystalline walls. It was a place of life in the middle of a frozen mountain, a symbol of the balance we had brought to the world. We walked through the garden in silence, the only sound the soft rustle of our robes and the distant, happy hum of the citadel above. Michael stopped by a small pool of water that had collected near the base of the anchor, the surface perfectly still and clear. He turned to me, the golden light in his eyes reflecting the beauty of the chamber, and pulled me into his arms. The heat between us was no longer a desperate surge to survive. It was a gentle, steady thrum of a love that had found its home. I leaned against his chest, listening to the powerful beat of his heart, feeling a sense of peace that I had never thought possible for a girl from the outer rim. We were no longer survivors. We were sovereigns. "You've changed everything, Juno," he whispered, his voice a low, melodic purr that made my blood sing. I spent my entire life waiting for the cold to finally claim me, thinking that my only purpose was to be a shield that eventually broke. I didn't know that there was a light worth living for until you looked at me in that throne room and refused to blink. He leaned down, his breath ghosting over my ear in a way that made a delicious shiver run down my spine. I think about that night every time I look at you. The way you stood your ground while everyone else was trembling. You were a little wolf with a spine of steel, and I knew right then that my world was never going to be the same. I stepped back just an inch, a playful smirk spreading across my face as I looked up at the man who had become my entire world. I reached up and adjusted the ice wreath on his head, my fingers lingering on the soft hair at his temples. I reminded him of the fear I had seen in his own eyes that night, the shock of meeting someone who wasn't impressed by his crown or his growl. I told him that the monster he had tried to be was a terrible actor, and that I had seen the lonely man hiding behind the furs from the very first moment. He laughed, a deep, genuine sound that filled the chamber with a warmth that had nothing to do with magic. He stepped closer, his chest brushing against mine, his hands coming up to rest on my waist. The smirk on his face was the same one from the first night. Dark, dangerous, and intoxicating. But this time, it was filled with a promise of a future we would build together. He leaned in, his lips inches from mine, his voice dropping to that familiar, vibrating growl that always made my heart skip a beat. "I told you once that you should be ready to find out what I could do to you, little wolf," he said, his silver gold eyes locking onto mine with a fierce intensity. "Are you still ready to find out?" I didn't say a word. I simply pulled him down into a kiss that was our final, triumphant defiance against the dark.